You're listening to the Control System Integrators Association's Talking Industrial Automation podcast, where you get to know the people that make modern manufacturing and processing possible. Now, here is your host, Tony Verhoeven.
Thanks for downloading the Talking Industrial Automation podcast. This is a show to help you get to know the people that make modern manufacturing and processing possible. I'll be talking industrial automation with CSIA system integrators and industry partners to get a better understanding of how they help their clients solve manufacturing and process challenges, and how they became successful in their careers. Along the way, we will touch on system integration best practices, technology, trends, and challenges. Whether you are a manufacturer, end user, supplier, or system integrator, I hope you will enjoy the insights CSIA members will bring to this podcast. Hi, it's Tony Verhoeven, and we're talking industrial automation with Tom Burke with the OPC Foundation. Tom, thanks so much for taking some time to sit down with me here. You're working from your home today?
I'm actually working from one of my offices, which is a 160-year-old century home that I've converted into an office. But I'm working away. So, Tony, it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to do this interview with you. I'm very excited about the opportunities that we've been pursuing with the OPC Foundation and CSIA. We've been doing this probably close to about 8 years now, and there's a very significant benefit to the OPC Foundation and also, I believe, to CSIA of the partnership we're doing between our two organizations. What I think I probably ought to do is I should introduce myself. I'm Thomas Burke, and I'm the president and executive director of the OPC Foundation. I spent most of my career actually doing industrial automation. I worked for a small company called Rockwell Automation for a long period of time, let it go at that. And during the course of my career at Rockwell, in 1995, we started the OPC Foundation, and the value of end users and system integrators, we quickly realized, could not be underestimated. And with that, I mean, essentially, OPC is an industry standard, essentially to help end users and specifically system integrators get away from the mundane tasks of some of the software development challenges they had with connecting up multiple vendors' equipment. So that's kind of how we started, and we'll go from there.
Very good, very good. So is OPC? I mean, I'm kind of a layman, I guess, from the terms of or from the angle of CSIA to OPC, but just for anyone listening and helping me understand, is my understanding is that OPC is kind of like helps set the standards, or at least facilitates the standards, so that it's easier for manufacturers' equipment to talk to one another or be integrated. Is that correct?
Tony, you're well in line with exactly what that is. When we started OPC, originally it stood for what was known as OLE for process control, which OLE stood for object linking and embedding. And the concept was that you could take a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet and embed it in a Microsoft Word document. And when you updated Excel, magically it would update in Word. And this common thought of interoperability and having application-to-application interaction like that proliferated ourselves into OPC, which was targeted for process control and factory automation to essentially allow many devices in factory automation and process control to be able to access data from those devices for the first tier visualization application. And again, the importance of this from like the systems integrator perspective, the last thing that a system integrator wanted to have to do is constantly worry about all this hardware underneath in their control systems, and every time the hardware changed, they have to write more complicated software, which typically was driver software, to access data from the devices. So OPC became the de facto standard. Ultimately, we've made it an IEC standard. We're very well populated from an international perspective. But the idea was to really solve a problem for the system integrators and end users with what I call data connectivity and communication to factory automation and process control devices.
So where did this all come from? Was this just a bunch of engineers that got together and said, hey, we thought this would be a good idea? Did you start this organization? Where did this all come from?
So it's kind of actually a funny story to this. And, so there's a lot of people that know the story, and it's important to tell, though. So I was working for a company called Rockwell at the time, and we had Rockwell Software. And then there was Intolution, which, ultimately got acquired by Emerson and then got acquired by GE, and they were an HMI solution. Then there was Fisher Rosemont, which was a DCS supplier that's now acquired by Emerson, and an IO company called Opto22. And the four respective presidents of those companies essentially were realizing that, they were competing with some of the other vendors, particularly the company was Wonderware at the time. And in 1995, Wonderware was the, glamorous HMI company out there that essentially did really good jobs of device connectivity. And they had a standard out there that was based on something called DDE. And I'm going to, go back in time here, because DDE was the standard for, essentially getting data into Microsoft Excel. So with OPC, the goal was we created this as a task force of engineers. And it was funny, when we started this, I was just an engineer and I wanted to write a lot of code. And the idea was we wrote code basically that did this first standard, and then we documented the standard. But the whole idea was these four companies wanted to basically, they were tired of Wonderware owning the market for device connectivity. It made an interesting challenge for me over the years to make sure that I really need Wonderware to be friends with me too, because I need to have Wonderware on board. But, ultimately, the guys from Wonderware, pretty quickly came right on board, and they became one of my most significant companies actually helping drive the standardization.
So when you look at like a group of logos on your website, you see a lot of different companies like Wonderware, and you see a bunch of these groups out there. Obviously, like you just mentioned, some competitors, and so, but I think a lot like CSIA, we have a lot of competing system integrators, but all under the CSIA umbrella, and trying to advance their own profession, which makes, I think, everybody better. But so it sounds like a little bit of the same type of thing going on, is that everybody's heard the term frenemies, right? Where you're my friend, and but we're also in this together, and we're in the same type of business. And I talk to a lot of folks, they would rather lose business to a legitimate competitor who's got a certification or has all this training or is, of equal stature of some sort, with whatever profession they're in, versus, the low cut guy out there.
Tony, that aligns really well. I mean, with what you guys have done with CSIA, it mirrors exactly to the OPC Foundation, our membership. Our strategy from an OPC Foundation perspective has always been, the competitors, working together. That's why we're a nonprofit international standards organization, and it's funny. I tell this, kind of in a funny way. My board of directors, for example, is made up of some small companies like Microsoft, SAP, Yokogawa, Honeywell, Siemens. You get the drift. So, all of these companies basically are competitors, but at the same time, they recognize the value of, the end users and the system integrators really want information integration, particularly when you think about all the, applications and devices that are out there right now. And what you brought up is, if you look at our website and the number of members we have, I mean, we've got a little over 600 members. You don't have to be a member of the OPC Foundation to build an OPC product, right? Our specifications are available for free. They're IEC specifications. Our technology actually is open sourced on GitHub. Even our certification program that we have is available to members and non-members. So the analysts tell me that probably we're approaching about 6,000 different companies right now that actually build OPC products, in addition to a lot of the end users and system integrators that use the OPC technology as a mechanism for essentially, information integration interoperability. One of the things that I think is really important with the OPC Foundation, and the C probably stands for collaboration now. We really work with a lot of other organizations, and particularly information modeling organizations. I talk a lot about machine tools, and we have a partnership with VDMA, which is a German-based, organization that has things for machine tools and robotics and vision. We work with MT Connect, right? We work with the OMAC organization and Weedhoff, and OMAC has a standard called PAC-ML. And what happens is OPC becomes the conduit for helping these guys, essentially, communicate this information generically. So the beauty of this is you can take an application like Microsoft Excel that understands nothing about our industry, but it can connect up to one of these applications or devices that understands this information model, and it can consume the data. So, often I get into the bits and bytes and I talk about syntax and semantics, but the importance of collaboration with all these organizations and what we've done with our new technology that's not so new anymore, called the unified architecture, really helps out, the companies to, take advantage of everything we're talking about with this industrial Internet of Things and Industry 4.0 and all the other Industry 4.0 knockoffs that go across regional boundaries.
Great. So what you mentioned in there OMAC, and so tell us a little bit about kind of what your relationship is with OMAC, or kind of what's the converse between you and OMAC.
So it's funny with OMAC. I've known these guys from OMAC for a long time. Back when they were, housed their organization under many things, and they had probably close to 1,000 different end users that were part of the organization. And one of the guys that and him and I are really good friends is a guy named Brian Griffin from Nestle, and he kept saying, there's really value in, what we do with this PAC-ML standard. I really want all my vendors to support, these packaging machines being able to seamlessly be connected and share information. And Tom, I don't want to be locked into one single vendor. So, Brian was at Nestle, and he's now at PMMI. And he came to me one day and said, let's go do a OPC PAC-ML something. And he said, I don't know what I'm talking about, but I know you do, so let's go make this work. So we formed a partnership with OMAC, and again, we had a long history with them, and we developed what was known as an OPC UA companion specification, and I got to tell you, there is a multitude of vendors that, again, because it was driven by, Nestle and Arla Foods, and now what's happening in packaging, it's dribbling down into all the pharmaceutical companies, because everybody's looking they want these complex packaging machines to be able to work together, from both a security, safety, and reliability perspective. And what we've done is, with partnership between OMAC and the foundation, OPC Foundation, is we actually have a standard that allows them to have information exchange between the multitude of packaging machines. We've been doing a lot of the PAC Expo trade shows. We've got another one coming up this fall. And again, the first big one we did was in Las Vegas. And I got to tell you, they're literally at PAC Expo in Vegas, there were thousands of these vendors there, right? And, the whole goal was they wanted to have interoperability between them. And, so Brian was well positioned on this right away. And there's another guy from from Arla Foods, Arne Svensson, who I've also known forever. And these guys recognize, the value of this. More importantly than, the end users, again, were driving this, right? And they worked with the system integrators because, they wanted to make the system integrators job a lot easier for this standardization. So it's been a very exciting time with, and it's funny because Brian was in Switzerland when he first approached me again. And he actually lives in the same, we live 10 miles apart, in Cleveland, Ohio. He lives in Aurora and I live in Sugar Falls. So, we have lunch together every so often.
Yeah, it's really interesting how small of a community system integration, industrial automation, control systems, all of the packaging, these this manufacturing community is smaller than you think, even though with this multi-billion-dollar industry. Yeah. You definitely see a lot of the same players over and over again.
So that's really the beauty of this, and probably one of the most exciting things that I've had in my OPC career that I've been doing for 22 years now probably is the value of the relationships that we have, and really working with lots of people across industries. And again, it's funny because we talk about competitors working together, but we put aside our competitive strengths because the opportunity is, we all recognize and the value basically of interoperability, and all of us have to work together. And there's so much market potential out there, particularly as you think a lot of the things that are going on with the government and the regulations and stuff. And one of the ones I like to talk about is Industry 4.0. It's been out there a while, and it's the fourth revolution, but the German government, basically was looking for an opportunity to streamline manufacturing. And of course, I'm proud to say that OPC UA, from a communication information standards, part of the reference architecture of Industry 4.0, but more importantly, the opportunity was they're working with Nomura, they're working with all the end users, they're working with all the system integrators, right? And what they're recognizing is they want to make, manufacturing open and simple. I was at the Hanover Fair several years ago, and I was involved in they had a small session of about 3,000 people there, the opening ceremony. And it was interesting. The German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, and Barack Obama were there at the time. And what Angela talked about was, and really resonated well with me, is about, what automation's all about. And again, this is a big automation trade show that she was presenting at in Hanover, but she talked about, we're not creating more jobs, and that's not what automation's about. What automation's about is creating a smarter workforce. And that really resonated well with everyone there. Obviously in automation, that's what we're looking for, right? You're creating a smarter workforce. You're doing more intelligent machines. I was just at a conference this week, the Internet of Manufacturing, and the whole Internet of Manufacturing, they're all talking about, all the end users are talking about, well, what do we do with all this IoT, and how does this work, and what do we do with all this technology? And there's this thing called blockchain, and there's a thing called cloud computing. And what happens is they're all overwhelmed with all this stuff, but they all recognize, what? We just need this stuff to work. Can't the suppliers, make our life simpler? And the opportunity is there's so much data out there with all these new devices in the IoT space that are getting connected, but really you want information out of these things. So, the beauty of open standards and things like that, and it's not just OPC, it's these other standards that we're partnering with deliberately, whether it's VDMA or MT Connect or PACML, that really allows these guys to do far more streamlined information integration and, take advantage of this stuff. So it's kind of evolutionary and revolutionary. I had the opportunity again to meet up with some people from ExxonMobil, and why they were at the Internet of Manufacturing is beyond me, but they were there and they said, Tom, we got this initiative that we're doing with the Open Group, and the Open Group is a long-standing organization working on open standards. There's an initiative called Open Process Automation, and it's very focused at oil and gas, but now it's also doing a lot of things with chemical. And it was driven from ExxonMobil's level of, we are tired of, being locked into a single vendor. Now, the single vendor maybe not like that idea, but they were tired of it. And they said, the value proposition of, we expect what's happening in consumer electronics and all the engineers, why can't we do the same thing in industrial? Okay. Why do we have to pay so dearly to make this stuff work from multiple vendors? So they're specifying open hardware, open software. They want all this stuff to work. They still expect that everything be secure and reliable, right? And they want all this stuff. So I think the end users speaking, and particularly the system integrators, who really are the ones that have to make this work for the end users, right, are all saying the same thing. You know what? We want interoperability. We really want to do this essentially to, be able to have and do more complex problems rather than doing a lot of mundane activities that, essentially the standards have set out to solve.
So I guess maybe you answered my question already, but I want to dig into that a little bit here. So who or what group is really driving, I guess, this demand for interoperability? Is it you guys saying, hey, we should do this, we should work with our fellow organizations, and so it makes it easier on system integrators and manufacturers? Or is it really the market? Is it the manufacturers that are saying, hey, we want this because we don't want to be tied into a monopoly, right? Tied to one vendor, and of course, maybe having higher prices? Or is it both?
That's a really good question, Tony. And what I think I've found, when we first started OPC, it was totally vendor driven. The vendors they had this problem. They wanted to have, essentially interoperability. They wanted to get out of this device driver business, and talking to all the hardware. But over time, it quickly got recognized once we achieved, a level of adoption of the OPC, like, wow, we can do a whole bunch of other stuff now. And what happened was the vendors continued to work together, but then what we found is like NMR and the end user organization, like I mentioned, the open process automation, or I mentioned OMAC. Actually, there's a very big initiative right now with the pharmaceutical. And I got to tell a little story related to that one too, but we've got a pharmaceutical arrangement, something called OpenSCS, and the regulatory bodies basically said we need to do serialization and track and trace across all pharmaceutical. And I had no idea what that meant. I mean, I know more about it than I care to admit right now. I was just in one of the meetings we just had in Frankfurt with all these pharmaceutical companies, and it's Abbott Labs and Pfizer and Amgen and Bayer, and the list goes on, where they all said, the government regulations are for serialization, but at the same time, this is important to the pharmaceuticals more than just from a government standpoint. There's so many counterfeit drug manufacturers out there across regional boundaries that, the pharmaceutical companies are getting hurt by that. They invest a lot of money into research for these pharmaceuticals, and they don't want to have these knockoff counterfeit companies come in and, blow them away and lose all this money that they had. So that's been a very big initiative there. As a matter of fact, a number of years ago, I was at a CSIA conference, and I remember that Jose Riviera, him and I, we went out and did a bunch of things at the CSIA conference that were just wonderful. We were kayaking at night and things like that. But one of the things that we did is he had set up a tour of the Amgen facility in Puerto Rico. And that was an eye-opening experience, because I think anybody that wants to get entrenched in industrial automation, at level of the pharmaceutical, you need to go to one of these pharmaceuticals, because when you start recognizing the problems that they have, and once they start the whole process of building the pharmaceutical, they can't afford to have their system go belly up or stop or pause over a 40-day or 60-day period. If they stop, everything's lost. And, so when you start thinking about that really opened my eyes. That basically I said, you know what, we really need to take this thing seriously. Now I understand why the pharmaceutical companies, it's so important for them to have security and reliability of what they're doing in these automation systems, right? And there's a big opportunity there. And so, I'm seeing the same thing in, not only in pharmaceutical, again, it goes into the petrochemical. The end users are demanding this thing, right? And the suppliers are recognizing, we need to deliver to the end users. The end users are saying they want to have interoperability, right? And that's been the big challenge. So do my vendors still want to drive stuff? Oh, yeah. My vendors want to build the best of breed products out there, and they want to solve problems that the end users haven't and the system integrators hadn't even thought of. I think the reality is the end users and system integrators are thinking about them. They just don't know what to do. Okay, we don't have solutions from the vendors that are going to solve our, cloud security problem. We don't know what to do with, they're scared to death of cloud computing. But the reality is, we're going to be there. You think about autonomous vehicles. There's some technology right now that, okay, everybody's scared of that to some degree. Some of us are really excited about it. But essentially, a vehicle has all this technology inside of it. It has a network. It has all these devices that need to be connected. And at the same time, you want to get information out of there. So I participated in an initiative specifically, again, was driven by the automotive companies, where they recognized we've got all this diagnostic information inside the vehicle. What we want to do is be able to do predictive maintenance on the vehicle. So guess what? When the car has got to go into service, we can actually schedule the time that it's going into service. And when it goes into service, we're going to know exactly what parts it need to be replaced. What a radical concept. How about simplifying the way we do, business in an automotive perspective? And the same is true with, when you're thinking about an automotive factory. I meet with Ford and GM all the time. And, I've been meeting with a lot of the Korean companies right now in the automotive. And what they're looking at is, we can't afford a line to go down. We need to know well before the line goes down, what are the things that we need to replace? You have to replace parts on a line, but the concept is, what do we have to replace so that we can do orderly shutdown and, that we don't lose production? Because the problem is, and particularly even in automotive, but more importantly in any of the process control, you can't just shut something down, right? You got to be able to shut this down in an orderly fashion, because you can't afford to throw away batches of product, right?
Right, exactly. So what does it, what does it mean to an end user to be, involved? Or I should ask, are they part of the organization? Do you guys have like an end user advisory board, or what? How do they give you input and direction into these rules and standards that they're wanting?
Tony, that's another really good question. When we started this thing, again, it was 100% suppliers, right? Over a period of time, probably 15% of my membership now is end users. We do have an end user advisory council. Actually, there's a proposal on the table right now that we want to put one of the end users on our board of directors. It's interesting because, some of our suppliers actually are end users themselves, okay? So, for example, there's a lot of these Japanese companies that I work with. Now, Mitsubishi's a supplier, but also they're an end user as well, because you think about what they're doing with, the equipment. And the same is true with Siemens and Rockwell, right? They actually use a lot of the automation to build their PLCs. So it's interesting that, they have that same requirement. You go into a, Rockwell manufacturing facility, and the first thing you realize is not everything is Rockwell that's doing this, automation. So they're kind of end user in the same way as a supplier. But I'm seeing a lot more of the end users, really wanting to work on these things. Again, it was the pharmaceutical, it's the oil and gas, it's the chemical companies. And all these guys are basically constantly involved in many of our OPC, working groups. And you think these guys don't know anything? We are so wrong, because they know so much about technology, and they're really, very focused at. They come into these meetings and essentially they say, we want our suppliers to do A, B, C. why? And the suppliers say, well, we can't. They say, wrong answer. Go figure out how to do A, B, C. And you can see where they're going. I mean, they're very concerned about the future, but they're also very concerned with, some suppliers say, well, we've got the solution for you for the future. Well, but what about all these installed base that I have out there right now? How are you going to make this thing work? Don't just give me a gateway or a bridge to this stuff. You got to natively make all of my equipment work together. And that's kind of the focus. And I really recognize the value of the end users and the system integrators. We have quite a large set of system integrators that are actively participating in the foundation. And there is so much value. Matter of fact, when I go to a CSIA conference, you take a look at, typically there's 60 or 70, of my members that are there, that basically know that they need to get to the audience of CSIA, and they take a table there and they present and they want to network with all the system integrators, because I think the system integrators are even more important sometimes than the end users. And I'll probably, offend some of the end users by that. But the system integrators, they're really the ones that, where the rubber meets the road, they got to make this stuff work. And typically they have to do whatever the end user wants, but these are my first point of contact in a lot of times. And that's what I always tell my suppliers. You got to work with CSIA. And if you're not a member of CSIA, you don't know what you're doing. You need to be a member of CSIA. And, I think CSIA has every one of the major automation suppliers are members of CSIA today. So I'd be surprised if they're missing one. So.
Yeah, there's we've got most of the big boys out there, and I think it comes down to if they're not, it just comes down to, I think, bandwidth. A lot of times, I think the biggest challenge, I just kind of a little divergent here with membership, is that a lot of the times the reason why a large manufacturer, an OEM supplier type is out there, automation supplier, is just upward mobility, right? Tom's at Rockwell, and then Tom goes to work for OPC, and well, that was Tom. Now who do we talk to at Rockwell, right? And so, so that happens all the time. So we usually have a champion, and then that champion goes away and moves to another company or gets promoted or something like that. And so there's always that challenge of making sure. So we appreciate you being kind of a membership development representative out there for us.
No problem. I'm sincere about that, because again, I really think that the work that CSIA does with the system integrators and that whole certification program that you guys have is so important. And, you cannot underestimate the value of that. Matter of fact, the first thing that I hear from a lot of the end users is that, they go to CSIA and they want to know specifically, what, we want to work with the guys that are members of CSIA, because we know that CSIA, has this network. They have this ability. They basically, become the real organization that really helps drive certification. So, the foundation, we do certification of products. And I've been thinking about, how do we certify, developers and things like that. I can't really get into that space because, I got a lot of my vendors that do that, but they don't necessarily do it, in what I call a synchronized fashion. And I recognize what CSIA has done is, I applaud you guys, because what you have done for the industry is, definitely, it's rocket science. You have solved a problem, and you've really built an infrastructure in place that, when an end user is looking for a system integrator, they know that if they go to somebody that's certified from CSIA, that, it's going to work. And they're going to get good assurances versus, just pulling from a local supplier that, isn't part of this thing. And I see a lot of this from, some of the system integrations, things that are inside of a lot of my major automation vendors. They're also recognizing, wow, every one of our guys should really be certified by CSIA.
Right,
right. And it's so important, because we're in a, products are wonderful. But also what's recognized is, particularly where we are now, it's really become more of a services industry. all my historian vendors, for example, they make far more money off of services than they make off of, the products that they sell, right? And it's, some of it I wonder, should they be making money off of services for their products? Are they making the products work? But I think what they're really trying to do is they're trying to make, people more effective using their products. And I think that's the basis behind that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we appreciate the nice words about CSIA. So I have a question about I guess end users and their awareness and demand of like standards with regards to hardware and OPC. I guess what I see a lot is when we talk about large companies, Exxons and the Philips and the BPs of the world and the gigantic, Nestle's, the gigantic corporations out there. And I think they see the need for these standards and they demand it and they're heavily involved. I think one thing we're challenged with, and then it comes back to a system integrator saying, hey, we're not seeing people demanding certification, right? And if they are, I've been at the Rockwell Automation Fair. I've been at Siemens Manufacturing America and some of these larger user groups, I guess, so to speak, sort of conferences. And when I talk to them, or when they come up to our booth, they'll say, "Oh yeah, we love that you guys have the standard, the certification." But it's always the big guys, right? And so out in California, it's the large municipalities that are demanding certification for water, wastewater. So what about the, I don't want to say mom and pop, but there's a lot there. I would venture to say a big bulk of what kind of manufacturing happens in America is like rural or small town America, where they're the major employer. They employ 50, 200 people. They're well known in their region. You may never hear of them, but they're out there, right? What about those guys, right? Are you hearing from manufacturers out there that are asking for these standards, or are they the kind of people that say, I've never heard of CSI, I've never heard of OPC or OMAC, that sort of thing?
It's an interesting thing because, and I'll speak for both CSIA and OPC, the certification and things, in a lot of ways, you get, some companies that, it's not free to do this, right? It's not only, it's a cost, but it's also a time. And a lot of times they can't get certified. I mean, I can't tell you, how many OPC products come through our certification lab, for example, and we used to give it away for free. And deliberately, certification was a benefit of membership. We didn't charge people. What I found is that a lot of companies would take advantage of that and they'd throw a product over the wall, right? And it's like, this thing's not ready for certification. But I think what's happening is, particularly now, the end users, in the last 2 years, they're really driving and they're really getting, they're now recognizing, wow, you know what? We've had a lot of problems, right? And we can't afford to keep having these problems and then do finger pointing between vendors. I think 10 years ago, a lot of the companies were locked into a single vendor. And so therefore, well, maybe it wasn't such a big issue. And, it wasn't such a big issue to hire an SI that, isn't certified. Okay. But now, Tony, in the last couple years, with so much increase in opportunity in, IoT and all these regulations and stuff, I think you're going to see a lot more value in this. I've been working with the guys at ISA, for example, and, they're really trying to beef up their whole program related to the stuff they do, and for the longest time, they, used to make a lot of money off of trade shows, and they don't do trade shows anymore to that. But, they're seeing the value in conferences now. And it's interesting because in Europe, for example, we go to conferences in Europe, and every conference I either attend or the OPC sponsors, we end up standing room only. It sells out. it hasn't populated that well into North American yet. But again, I was at just this week in Chicago at an Internet of Manufacturing event. And it's a bunch of guys, it's a company out of London, of all things, that basically runs these things in Chicago and San Diego and other places in Dallas. And literally they sold out. I mean, it was interesting. They sold out because there were so many end users. And when I got up and I moderated a half day of session, and one of the big questions they kept asking is, what, we want to buy products from these vendors, Tom, but how do we make sure these products work? And how do we make sure that the system integrators that are helping us assemble our system, know what they're doing and they understand OPC? So, it's still a challenge, right? And, people would like to, I'd like to avoid it. For example, what? Think about your standard thing, right? I don't want to, you don't want to maintain your equipment, right? I don't want to maintain my car. Wouldn't it be nice if the car, I never had to maintain it? Okay, well, you know what? It's not real. And the same thing is true if you start thinking about, you want to buy products and you want to get quality people to do the work. If you're going to go hire a painter for the inside of your house, right? You want to make sure the guy knows what he's doing, right? And, that's kind of the example that I use. You're going to get a reference, or you're going to find out somebody that you're going to know this guy is a really good painter. And that's the value that CSIA offers, right? And, that's the message that, you and I have to keep pushing out. Like, go get one of the vendors that, is certified by CSIA. Go buy products that are certified by the OPC Foundation. If you want to have, I'm not going to say it's going to solve every single problem, but I will tell you that the level of, reliability of the system that ultimately comes out of that, right, is going to be very well recognized, and the end users don't want to deal with the pain anymore, right? They really want to have this stuff. So it's up to you and I to do a better job, basically marketing our certification. Right. But I think you're going to find out that the end users really are, particularly in the last 2 years, there's a whole new momentum out there. The pharmaceutical guys are all over this. And consequently, because of regulatory agencies, this thing with Industry 4.0 and the German, right? And it's all the knockoffs. I mean, in France, it's Industry to Future. In China, it's Made in China 2025. And you see what they're doing. And every one of those is basically mandating, certification of products and certification of engineers, right? And that's all part of, that the Industry 4.0 and its equivalent knockoffs.
Very good. Well, Tom, let's switch gears here a little bit here. When we first started talking, we were just kind of talking about what we were going to talk about, and and so actually, I just kind of thought of something I wanted to ask you, especially since I discovered that you were at Rockwell. So years ago, you were at Rockwell before, as an engineer there. What is it different as far as the problems? Obviously technology has changed, right? But are the problems that end users are having, other than obviously security issues, are the same kind of like meat and potatoes problems the same as they were today? And if so, what are those things?
It's funny because when I first went to Rockwell, I knew nothing about. Matter of fact, it was called Allen Bradley at the time. It was even before Rockwell bought Allen Bradley, and it was in 1984. And I went to work for them basically to go work on this, HMI. And I had no idea what an HMI was. I had no idea what a PLC was. I had no idea, right? And it was interesting because one of the first projects we worked on was called the Vista 2000. And it was one of these Unix-based supercomputers, HMI, full data acquisition capability. And we started writing our own programming language, and it was exciting. It was so fun. I have no idea how there was no way Rockwell was ever going to be able to sell this thing. It was it was the best boat anchor I ever worked on. But and they spent tons and tons of money on this thing. But in the course of this, I learned a lot about the end users, because we took this system and essentially we had to go make them work. And, I spent, for example, one weekend over the 4th of July in Wilmington, Delaware, at a paint shop where they were, doing painting Corsicas and Berettas. And I learned all about a paint shop. And, I learned about the stacker. I had paint all over myself. But, we were trying to, basically do automation. And this was in the early 80s, right? And the whole thing was still true. The opportunity was you wanted to visualize things. They wanted to be able to maintain their equipment. They wanted to get, information out of, the system in a more intelligent fashion. And the technology was hard then. Now over times, when I used to build systems, we had to use what was known as emulators for the embedded systems. Now, the engineers of today, everything is visual. Everything is like, this is just so easy. It's not funny. In a lot of ways. But now they can do more things because they got better technology, right, than we had back in the 80s that allowed them to do, more complex development. But the answer to the question is, what? The problem is really still the same. It's how do you visualize your equipment? How do I do things like predictive maintenance, right? How do I get information, and be able to not just get all raw data. I remember when I was at this facility in Rochester, and I was meeting with the CIO, and he was all excited, and I don't want to name the company. He said, I can monitor all my different lines, and I got 30,000 I/O points, and it's on my one screen. And it's like, oh my God, you don't get it. I realized that the problem he had is he's got all this data, but at the CIO level, he didn't want all that data.
Right.
He wanted to have information. And that's what OPC and working with like CSIA and all these other organizations, we're all looking for information now. They don't want the raw data. Now we've solved the raw data problem. Now let's get information. Now let's, be able to take this. But the problem we face now is the proliferation now of new data sources, right, that are coming out. The IoT world has made things so easy, but it's also complicated in our life because now you've got even, terabytes of data out there that a typical manufacturing plant, never had before. Typically when I did process control, it was common to have 3,000 I/O points. Okay, now some of the systems I'm looking at Statoil and BP and ExxonMobil, they're looking at 300,000, I/O points because they can get the data now. But now they got to take that data and make something useful out of it, right? So that, that's the big thing with analytics and, of taking this all together. And I think that's a real big opportunity for the system integrators, really taking advantage of, what? We got all this data, but let's really help with all the analytics software out there and make it useful information that, you can make intelligent decisions on. So the problem has just gotten bigger. It's the same problem we had years ago, but now the opportunity has gotten bigger. So I like to use opportunity rather than problem, but yeah. it's a new opportunity for us, Tony.
Absolutely. I love it. Challenges and opportunities. So Tom, where did you, let's go way back now. Where did you grow up here and how did you, kind of take us on your path to where you are today?
So I grew up in pretty much in Cleveland, Ohio. I got my bachelor's of mathematics from a college here in Cleveland called John Carroll University. I'm a theoretical mathematician by trade. I think there were 7 of us in the math department in my graduating class, and I still keep in touch with a few of them. And I ended up going to work. I started teaching initially, and I recognized that, maybe teaching wasn't where I wanted to go. And probably some days I think I really wish I would have pursued that, but I never would have had the opportunities I've had now. Then I went to a company called NCR, and I started working on financial systems, and I had no idea what those were either. And I did the software basically for the first ATMs they were rolling out. So that was interesting. I think I still got some of the play money we used to use in the ATMs because I did all the programming software for that. We did transaction processing system. I spent about 5 years down there, and I got my master's from the University of Dayton in computer engineering. Actually, I specialized in compiler design. Most people don't know even what a compiler is these days, but I did that. And that's how I ended up at Alan Bradley because I started, they said, well, we need somebody that understands how to write, compilers. And so, I had worked at NCR. We'd actually wrote our own language called NCRL, which was, again, why are we doing this? Languages exist, but it was fun. And then when I did Alan Bradley, we did the same thing. And then I quickly, migrated in, and I learned everything about PLCs. In the old days of, Alan Bradley and Rockwell, you had to program the PLCs on the front panel. You talk about, complicated and the life of the system integrator. Then, it was very challenging, but now with the state of the art, and then we started with ladder programming. And I worked on this thing, which was a really big HMI. It was a Unix-based system. We'd actually partnered with a company in Cambridge, Massachusetts that did CAD-CAM. Now, how these guys became our vendor to go do an HMI when they were doing CAD-CAM is beyond me, but it was wonderful, and I spent 21 years at Rockwell, and I started OPC about the last 10 years of my career at Rockwell. And I remember my one president at the time, he said, I was looking for an executive director to run the OPC Foundation. Again, I was, I'm the CTO of Rockwell Software, and I had a great time, but, it got different over the years because you went from working with a small, tight group of people that were all friends, over a period of time, now there's hundreds, now we're doing remote development. And actually most of my staff in the later years were, I was based in Cleveland, Ohio, and they're in Dayland, right? So, all my engineers were in China, right? And that was interesting in itself. And, we had a lot of engineers, in Europe as well. So, my president said, well, why don't you take this job as the executive director of OPC? And I said, why would I want to do this? And he said, because you know OPC better than anybody. Go do it. So, and at that time I started what was known as unified architecture when I left Rockwell. And the unified architecture, again, the first version of OPC was very tied to Microsoft. But UA basically is, it's platform independent, right? It's vendor independent, right? It's operating system neutral, right? And it's really about information integration. And it's been a great opportunity. I still live outside of Cleveland, Ohio. My staff is all based in, the U.S. staff is all based in Scottsdale, Arizona. That's a little segue there. I always find myself going out there in January. So I beat it out of the Cleveland weather. My wife's like, there you go again. You're going to Scottsdale in January. And, I got one of those bad habits. I collect cars. So I always get a chance to go out to the car auctions in Scottsdale at that time.
Very good. What kind of cars do you collect?
I collect cars. I have a number of what known as Bricklins. They were made in 74, 75, and 76 by a company called Bricklin. And there's a guy named Malcolm Bricklin who I've met personally multiple times now. He's in his 80s now, and he's still as wild as he always was. It was a company that built, they were built in New Brunswick, Canada. He was a visionary. But, they only built 2,900 of these cars for a reason before he went out of business. So he's got an interesting, it's a gull-wing door car. It's not a DeLorean, right? It was made well before DeLorean, but it's a novelty.
Very cool. So you have a garage, special building for these things?
I do. I have a heated garage deliberately that I keep these cars in. And, my wife says, you take better care of them sometimes. I'm like, no, I don't. But, they're my babies. They're definitely my babies, and sometimes I take them to a lot of different car shows at different places when I find the time. So
my wife right now is in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, presenting at the American Hemerocallis Society. Those are daylilies. And so she's a daylily nut. She's the president here of the state association here. And some of these plants, they have pretty advanced genetics, and so there's genetics geeks here around daylilies. And some of these things can go for hundreds of dollars. And so we have an extensive garden full of some expensive plants, but my wife always says, it's cheaper than heroin or any other drug that you can insert. So
yeah,
so your cars are they are an asset, and an investment, and cheaper than drugs, I guess.
I Yeah, that's true. I probably put more money into them than they're worth keeping them running, though. So that's a different hobby. But
maybe not an investment.
Yeah, it's just one of those things that you meet a lot of interesting people when you're running these car shows and stuff like that. So
very good, very good. Well, that's cool. So you're actually one of the first people I've talked to who doesn't necessarily have like an engineering, like a double E sort of thing. So how did you? I guess, was it a challenge to go to Rockwell? I mean, but you had obviously several jobs that maybe they kind of count as a pedigree leading up to that, but you're not a double or an electrical engineer. How did that kind of feel going into that? Do you feel like you had all these the jobs that kind of led right up to that?
I think predominantly, again, it was a culture of people that we assembled initially when I went to Rockwell. And one of my colleagues at the time, him and I started both on the same day. Actually, he had a degree in psychology. Mine was, I did have a degree in computer engineering, but I really hadn't used it yet, right? And so it wasn't an EE degree, which, typically you had. But when we assembled this team at the time, actually, we assembled people that were from a wide variety of different disciplines, because what we recognized over a period of time is, we really need to have people from different disciplines, different, ideas, really to assemble and gel a team. And, over my career, we did some interesting things. I got involved with a guy named Jerry Weinberg. And if you go take a look at him, he was a visionary as well. And what he taught you was, it's not the technology that's important. It's not your background that's important. It's really about trust and relationships and how you work in a team. And you think about this even in terms of a lot of the sports and things like that. You can have really a superstar that really understands everything, but you can't carry the weight and be the only person, right? You really need a multitude of set of people. And so what I've learned over my career was, as I assembled different things during Rockwell, it was more important. And a lot of times people I would hire in, people would say, why are you hiring them? They know nothing about what we do. And I said, that's exactly why. You bring them in because they bring in fresh blood. They bring in a different perspective on things. So, I'm not devaluating or underestimating the value of an EE and things like that. But, over a period of time, you use less and less of what you learn in school and your background. And I still think, going to college is so important, right? But it's important not what you learn, it's that you learn how to learn. And, that's the way that people become successful, because particularly in industrial automation, you could never learn everything you need to learn in college. I'm actually working with a lot of universities to really help jumpstart, so that they have an understanding and they're not just academic. The OPC standards, and I apologize to academia, they're not academic. We do these things for a reason. They've got to be, adopted, right? I measure success by the level of adoption. So, Tony, to that point, what I have found over a period of time, and particularly with my OPC, staff and the volunteers we've assembled, we actually look to get, people from a different set and a different perspective, right? And, again, I learned that from the Endusers. I learned that from, my first starting at, Allen Bradley, that, none of us knew anything about industrial automation when we first started our project. Maybe that's why the project failed. I don't know. But no, Rockwell couldn't sell it at the time. But we learned a lot. And we learned a lot, and we came from a lot of different disciplines. And, now I've had the opportunity over my career to work with so many different companies, and I'm running into people all the time. And the biggest problem I have is I'm up on stage and, somebody remembers me and I have no clue who they are. And, again, it happened this week where, people approached me, and there was a company called Nerdery. And I'm like, I have no idea what these guys do. I obviously talked to him. I couldn't even remember where I talked to him. He said, well, you and I were at that conference in Minneapolis. It's like, okay, good grief. That was like 2 weeks ago, and I have no idea who you are. So this is bad. So anyway, yeah, I really wasn't a challenge because I had learned how to learn. not what I learned, but I learned how to learn. And I think that's what I tell my children all the time. It's so important. I said, I don't care what language you take. It's more important that you learn a language and you learn how to be able to apply this, and you learn how to work in a team, and you learn how to support, your both your superiors and your subordinates. And, it's important. Like I tell my executive assistant all the time, she said, well, I'm your executive assistant. I said, no, you're not. You're my colleague. Your job is to make me look good. Okay. I don't want to know what you know. Okay. I don't need to know it. And, it's a whole different philosophy, Tony. But, that's kind of the mindset of how myself and most of my staff operate on.
Very good. No, I totally agree about the, hire the right people. The skills can be learned. And when I got my marketing degree, they didn't teach me anything about Google AdWords or how to do a podcast or technology of doing video or anything like that, right? You learn the 4 Ps. You learn, you buy a several $250 textbooks, and they send you on your way.
That's right.
And obviously, again, not to devalue it, I learned a ton, and you learn to finish something, and a great fundamental basis of marketing and theory. But you don't use theory when you talk about, I'm going to try to teach an end user about the OPC Foundation or the or CSIA or Rockwell Automation or whatever company. All that stuff is, it's a pedigree, it's back there somewhere, but learning how to create content and build relationships and learn as you go with new technologies and things like that. That's what's important. So always about the right fit. I love that.
It's always about the right stuff. And, I totally agree, right? This is so important as we, and we're inundated with technical innovations, and it's so hard to keep up with all the technology innovations that are out there. But I always encourage, you got to look for what technical innovations are most important to you. And again, that's something you can't, you just got to learn over time, and you got to evaluate. But more importantly, you build a trusted set of people around you. And this trusted set of people really, all of us collectively together, like we're looking at a whole new technology, and we've been, actively looking at it for a couple of years. I became aware of it one day, and I said, I like this thing. I don't know why I like it, but I think this is really cool. And it's called TSN. And really, it's the next wave of one of the things that OPCUA is working on. It's threatening to some people because it's an unknown, but it's like, well, we got to deal with the unknown. You got to deal with this. And, when you build a team of people that work together, we have no idea, what the possible applications are. But, some of the end users they hear about it, they get the buzzword. Next thing you know, well, we want it. They don't know why they want it, but they want it. But it's, one of those technologies that definitely will be, something of the future. And it's, again, I got a team of people basically, there's about 60 engineers right now that are working on how do we take OPCUA to work with TSN, and, all the other field bus organizations that I'm working with also now are looking at how do we work with this TSN technology. I don't know if it'll be real or not. I'm putting a lot of, money and resources behind this thing because I think it's a good thing. The other thing I think is also important that I have learned is, I like to dabble with technology, but, and I'm an engineer by trade that, now Tony, actually my whole job is marketing and evangelism, right? That's the whole goal of this. But so I dabble a lot with technology, and some of my engineers are scared when I come out and say, well, I got this new great idea. It's like, oh no, here we go again. But I've been dabbling with a lot of home automation stuff. And you probably can hear stuff in the background, and I apologize, people coming in and out of my doors. But, I see the value ultimately that home automation really hasn't been successful yet. But I think there is some, significant value in this thing. But I started looking at that from a more of a commercial building automation perspective. OPC, for example, has a very tight partnership with BACnet. And what we've recognized is people want data out of, all these HVAC systems. I want data out of all my thermostats, right? I want to be able to, tie in all these alternate sources of, fuel. And in the U.S., we really haven't capitalized well enough. I work with my school here locally, and I'm wondering if it was a good idea or not, but I was one of the people that proposed that we explore wind power and we explore solar. And it was interesting because, the schools are now doing it. And one of the more significant ones is there's an ice skating rink a couple blocks down from the school. They have totally, went, wind power essentially to generate all the electricity to keep this ice cold. Now, granted, most of the months a year in Cleveland, you don't have to worry about that. But, they have a very big ice skating program here, and, they went wind power. So I thought that's significant. Now, when you go to Europe, you see them, they're more conscious about, about energy, right, that I think than we are, but I think you're going to see that taking off. So I don't know where I'm going on this, but I see that the changes are going to continue to come. I tell stories all the time about, nobody knows what a paper map is anymore, Tony. I mean, and we got away from that. Maybe some people still use, right? But, then even you had the, standalone GPSs, and they exist in vehicles. But, guys like Garmin and Tomcat, they had to look at different sources, right? Because guess what? Now everybody uses a GPS on their phone as their mapping device. So, technology keeps changing. People adapt to it over periods of time. I won't wear the Fitbit because, my wife had me with a Fitbit, and she'd, say, you didn't exercise enough today. It's like, oh, okay. We got too much data. I don't want you to have all that data, right? But it's, and the other thing I talk about is like the tracking of things. We've got the technology to, to track where we are at all points in time. So you think about, a lot of political things that we could address, right, with technology.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an amazing and horrifying time all at the same time with data and what you can track and who can track it, and the perceived security of some of this data. So it's just interesting. And kind of to bring it back around, you talked about having like a Fitbit or things like that, and it's the data's always been there, right? Even without the Fitbit, the data, you're outputting the data, right? Biologically, you're just not collecting it. Now we're collecting it. Now, what do we do with it? A lot of people just like to have the toy of collecting it, but unless you make some changes based on the data, like I'm not walking enough, or I see that on my app I've eaten ice cream 3 times this month, and maybe I shouldn't do that, or 3 times this week. I don't know.
Yeah.
Right. So it's always comes down to that human interface of like, what do we do with that data? And maybe there's some should be some sort of a historian data around diets and eating and biological or diets and eating and food and all this stuff, so you can kind of like do something with it, kind of taking a page out of the book from industrial automation.
I think that it's funny because I was talking to some people that from a company that does like a lot of fleet management. And one of the things that they recognized in the trucking industry, they were, he brought up the thing that, well, the truck drivers were stopping at different places and, they were eating. And he talked about they're going to Whataburger or whatever, right? Or Rallies or whatever, and they're buying their burger. And they weren't shutting down the truck, and they were letting it run idle. And, they were only stopping for a period of time. So, but it was interesting that they were gathering data about this. They knew where the trucker stopped at, and they essentially said, well, they had to eat. We knew that. They were only stopping for fast food, but they took a look at what was the opportunity to save money on fuel, right? So the opportunity was, if they're stopping, they should be shutting down the truck. And why aren't they shutting down the truck when they're stopping? And they also talked about, if they're stopped during construction, and they're starting to look at the data of the, the cost of, okay, how long, if you're going to be shut down, makes it beneficial that you're going to save money, because, shutting down and then bringing it back up if you're only down for like 3 minutes probably doesn't make sense, right? And you do the same thing in, industrial automation, right? Sometimes it makes sense to, how long can you shut down a line? And if you shut down a line, do I shut everything down, or does it take too much energy to restart the line? And this is the kind of data that you gather that you make, can make intelligent decisions in. And they're gathering this kind of data in historian type software and in the enterprise software to make a decision, right? Make decisions on how we can, make more effective use of energy. And, I tell the story about the physical fitness stuff. I bike ride a lot. And what I found myself, though, is it actually, when I measure how much I'm riding, it actually stresses me out because, I didn't ride as fast this time. And it was because there were some people that were riding that were running slower. It's like, okay, that wasn't good. Why don't I just ride to have fun? Instead of gathering this data. So I got to work on that challenge with my wife. She rides with me as well. And she said, you got to quit getting stressed. I know you're training for pedal to the point, but, which is a 75-mile bike ride. And she said, relax, there's other people. It's Sunday. They're all riding on the path, right? You don't have to set, records there, but, you got the data, so you're looking at like, we didn't go as far this time as we could have in the same period of time as we went yesterday. It's like, shut up. That's what she says to me.
In this economy and it's that corporate think, right? Where, you always got to be going, the chart should always be going up.
Right.
Like that, right? So
keep growing
we're
up
all stuck in that, right?
Okay.
Well, go ahead.
Well, no, I mean, I agree with you. We're all stuck in that kind of mindset, and you're always, challenging yourself to do better. And that's what I see that my companies are doing. They recognize that there's opportunities, right, to, go in different directions where they can reduce, and get rid of a lot of the mundane things that they have to do that, they don't want to compete against. And at the same time, we talked about the big suppliers, they're starting to come on board with certification, both of the products and, like the system integrators, what you guys do. But I see a lot of the smaller companies that, they're recognizing the best way for us to get on our foot in the door and be able to compete. And I think that's kind of the message we keep pushing, right? If you want to compete in this global marketplace, get yourself, part of CSIA, get yourself part of OPC, get yourself certified, because this is going to be your jump start for you. This is going to get your foot in the door. And it's the same way is true with, when you think about, who you hire, right? You hire basically, not on an interview, you're hiring based on, what you think their perceived background is, okay? And a lot of the background is documented in CSIA, but then also the value of, the references and things you get. So, for example, when I talk to different people from CSIA, if they don't know who Jose is, I say, you should. You should know who Tony is. You should know, take advantage of the opportunities that CSA provides, and it will really help you increase your business. And I think that's such a significant value. And that's why my members become members of OPC. They don't have to. They don't have to join OPC to build an OPC product, but they recognize the opportunity to participate in this community, in the same community that CSIA has, right? It's a community and an opportunity to learn from each other. And really, they end up increasing market share a lot because of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you can't. I think a lot of people think, with they have this bootstrapping mentality, which is great, but you can't bootstrap in a vacuum, right? You need a community, you need help, and there's a lot of give and take when it comes to the road to success and that upward trend, for sure.
Perfect.
Tom, it's really been a pleasure to speak with you. Thanks so much for taking so much time out of your day to speak with me. I know that our audience is going to be excited to hear from you. So I'll be definitely posting this soon. and probably within the next week or so, and looking forward to hearing back from some people here and on our conversation. So I know they'll enjoy hearing from you.
Tony, thanks again for the opportunity. I mean, again, the partnership between OPC and CSIA is so important. We're really driving, trying to make sure we're building the right products and the right technology. And I so much value CSIA and what all the system integrators are doing. And I'm hoping I'm doing all the right things for the system integrators. And, again, I think the partnership between our two organizations is so important. And I just love to go to your conferences. And matter of fact, if one of your members hasn't been a member or they're not, going to the conference, go. Trust me, the value of it, the networking and all the sessions are so valuable to the system integrators. They should just attend. So with that, Tony, I thank you again. And thanks everybody that listens to us for taking time out of their busy day to, listen to our ramblings of where we're going and the future and how we tie the existing systems in yesterday.
Very good. Yeah, we hope we made your commute or your drive to a site visit that much easier, right? So that's what I hear. I've heard some feedback. People they listen to this on the way to a client or something like that. Like, oh, that's good. That's cool.
Okay.
Very good. Thanks so much. We've been talking industrial automation with Tom Burke, the OPC Foundation. Thanks a lot and take care. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe in iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Help others find us by sharing your favorite episode with a colleague and give us a rating in iTunes. Visit CSIAexchange.com/podcast for a full list of episodes. Contact us at podcast@controlsys.org. podcast@controlsys.org. Thanks to bensound.com for the music.
Thanks for listening to the Talking Industrial Automation podcast. Read the Industrial Automation blog and find and research qualified system integrators at CSIAexchange.com. For more information on why your system integrator should be CSIA certified, visit controlsys.org. controlsys.org.